This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
How's it, John?
How you doing?
You know, I've got the music playing in my head as...
Dun,
yeah.
dun, 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 dun. I think it's fading out by now.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's great.
So we walk in here and you start off by immediately talking about blowing up Iran. So what's going on?
No, I was just having a quite a civil but heated debate with some folks about comments Tucker Carlson recently made, saying that Barry Weiss, Tucker Carlson really hates Barry Weiss. This dates back quite a while, and the reason is because Tulsi Gabbard, who is being confirmed this week, might not get confirmed.
Yes, yeah.
Let's see. We'll talk about that on the next podcast. But point is her confirmation hearings are this week, and she previously went on Joe Rogan.
I do remember the Joe Rogan segment.
And made herself look like a fool.
Yeah, where Rogan just simply said, well, explain that to me.
Yes,
And,
so Tulsi said something negative about Barry. Barry said something negative about Tulsi.
Barry basically said that Tulsi was a pawn of the Russians because she had had the temerity to go to Syria and meet with Assad.
That was part of it, and there was other stuff as well, and essentially it was a typical sort of Dem talking point on Tulsi.
Yes,
and then when Joe,
which Rogan demolished by very simply just asking questions.
Exactly.
And
so
saying,
when Joe said, "Look, explain it to me," Barry couldn't, and she came out like a bit of a shield, to be honest.
Yes,
and since then, because Tulsi has a lot of friends on the right, specifically people like Tucker Carlson, because allegedly Tulsi's anti-war, although I don't buy that. But anyway, the point is...
Well, look, can we just agree that, being anti-launching forever wars and insisting that you have a strong military that will actually kick serious butt if anyone tries to step out of line, those are two different things. So there's a difference between starting a war, for example.
Yes, and having a strong military.
And having a strong military, which sends in troops to sort out shit.
Completely in agreement. So the argument was, Tucker recently made the statement, there's a clip going viral, basically, that says, Tucker has, in the clip says that Barry Weiss, essentially, her whole reason for existence is essentially to have a war, create or foment war with Iran, and that's what Barry Weiss wants. Okay, Barry Weiss, for those of you who don't know, runs the most successful Substack called The Free Press. It's also an online, and essentially she used to be a New York Times reporter who left the New York Times because she felt they were too woke and she wasn't as woke as them, and so she started The Free Press. And people like Douglas Murray, for example, write for The Free Press. And so this is the clip. Tucker Carlson says Barry's whole thing in life is she just wants war with Iran, and that's all she is. She's a warmonger who wants more war with Iran. And I'm just saying, look, that's not the case. I mean, the truth is she's bullish on Iran. She doesn't like them, and she has written stuff stating that they're a threat to the Middle East and to Israel, which she's a big supporter of. All untrue, in my opinion.
Well, look, if I use myself as an example, I'm certainly not pro-Iran.
Yeah.
Am I against the idea of starting a war with Iran? Yes.
Yes, as am I. So I just think, and unfortunately, it's one of those things where Tucker can have good points. He does regularly have good points. He makes good points and he has good guests on, but he makes mistakes as well. He gets things wrong, in my opinion. And this is one of those things, and I think it's just being driven by personal animus. He doesn't like Barry Weiss. He views her as a leftist, which is correct, because she comes from the left. I don't think she's changed that. To me, she's not a conservative all of a sudden. So I understand why he doesn't like her based on personal animus, the Tulsi thing, the Rogan thing, and then just coming from the New York Times. But you don't have to make up shit about her. You can just criticize her on the basis of fact. Ironically, Tulsi is as much of a leftist, in my opinion, as Barry Weiss. So they may have different views on things, but in terms of their political background, we have to remember that Tulsi comes from the Democrat Party, was a congresswoman.
But then so does Donald Trump. Let's not forget that. And
timing makes a difference, though. Timing makes a difference. This is kind of the stuff where you sort of say, look, 30 years is a period of time. People change their views. The Democrat Party, as we've discussed many times on the show, 30 years ago,
has shifted.
Had very different opinions to
Yes.
the Democrat Party today.
And at the same time, the Republican Party has shifted as well, from being a bunch of predominantly religious zealots at a number of levels to, being the party of common sense, as Trump likes to refer to it most of the time these days.
Yeah, let's bring it home because, and then obviously we can, as always, go abroad. But we've done America quite a bit to the last few episodes, and we will do some more next week. There's some interesting stuff to discuss there. I think the cost cutting is interesting. Maybe we'll get onto the aid stuff because that affects us. But I wanted to talk about the big stuff here recently, which obviously the biggest of which must be
the complete and utter failure of the DA to actually show any testicular fortitude whatsoever. Is that what you want to talk about?
Well, yes. Obviously, I want to talk about that. But as part of that, we get to that point by looking at the bill that Cyril Ramaphosa signed. It must be a week ago now. And the bill is the expropriation bill. And I want to get into some of the details because I know you will have read into the details. I have too. I know you will have gone even deeper than I have. I find a lot of the debates to be wrong on both sides, disingenuous, and unable to be forward predictive. So let's start off what is the bill actually? Because one of the things where I think people have been disingenuous is they say, well, there was a bill like this before. And so it's just a replacement of that bill. No biggie. And give us your take.
Well, I think your point that the inability to throw forward is a significant point. And, the fundamental thing that I drew back to at the point at which this furore actually began was, in as much as Ramaphosa likes signing things, and he does so on a regular basis, the ANC is fundamentally incapable of implementing anything that it actually puts into policy. And is this going to be a long, drawn-out process that's going to be seeing lots of legal challenges from lots of players? Absolutely. So at that level, this is not giving me the type of chest pains that a lot of people out there have actually been having.
That's the slightly rose-tinted, do you think, or not?
No, it's not slightly rose-tinted because I think it's very clear that there are going to be two types of responses to any attempt to actually enforce the bill. And let's be very clear. We can't have a legal challenge to the bill unless there's actually a use case to challenge the bill on very specific points. Now, one can actually at this point approach the Constitutional Court for a directive with regard to very specific aspects of the bill. Is that possible? Yes. Is the DA going to go through with that? The answer to that is yes. And I think that any attempt on our part right now to actually try and work out what direction this is going to go on until those challenges have actually played out is going to be short-sighted.
That's interesting. I mean, I want to bring it back. Let's get to that. I want to bring it back to first the difference between the law that existed before and the new law. To me, the fundamental and my understanding of it, having read both, is that previously the government could expropriate things that governments tend to need to expropriate. So, for example, and this happened, the previous government actually built infrastructure. So I'm not saying they were a great government. I'm sure someone will try and twist the words, but I will note that the previous dispensation, the apartheid government, actually built things like our major highways.
Yes, and my suburb, Buccleuch, the N3 cut literally through the entire suburb.
Right. And so when they built those highways, which our government hasn't really done, the government for the last 30 years hasn't built any major significant roads. Yes, they've added here and there a couple, but there's no road between Joburg and Cape Town that didn't exist 30 years ago that does now. There's no road between Cape Town and between Durban and Joburg. There's no railway. In fact, there's less railway, all of these things. Now, when they did that, there were times, as all governments need to, where the road is going down a straight path and suddenly someone's farm or someone's house is in the way. And so in America, it's called eminent domain. What will happen is the government will come along and go, look, we're building a highway here. We're going to come straight up to your property line, and we'd prefer not to take a giant curve around your property line, especially on a highway where curves have to be done over several kilometers. So we're going to give you a market rate for your property, and then we're going to continue building our road straight through.
Yes.
And so this happened, and you can see this. You talk about Buccleuch. It also happened downtown Johannesburg, so Newtown, where you see that double-decker. That exact same thing happened with a form of expropriation, but it was not without compensation. Now, there's a part of this bill. We have to remember how this bill came to be, because government could still expropriate land under the old Act.
Under the old law, absolutely, yes.
They could still do this. So they could still take land and private property, which I want to get to. They could still take it if they needed it for these reasons, but they would have to pay a fair price. Okay. Now, the new bill says you can't do that. It came into being as a result of talks about land from people like Julius Malema. And what it says in the bill is that a sum will be offered, but the sum could be nil.
Yes.
Okay. So that's someone who thinks they're being clever at a legal level and says, well, we won't offer you nothing. We'll just offer you a sum called nil, which is nothing, but it's still something because it's actually a sum we put onto paper. You see, we offered you this amount. It's an amount. The fact that it's zero is beside the point. It's still definitionally an amount. That's their argument. That's what they're going to try to get away with. Now, I think the freak out that's happened, and this is where I feel that people should temper themselves a little bit, is obviously them turning around and going, all right, well, we're going to be Zimbabwe 2.0. We're just like Zimbabwe. It's coming. I think there's a couple of steps that need to happen before Zimbabwe goes on. Zimbabwe even needed a couple of steps before it got there. So firstly, there was a lot of stuff that went on in the 20 years before farms were taken in Zimbabwe. Secondly, when farms got taken, that was done by mobs in many cases that arrived at farmlands and told farmers to get out. And Mugabe made the decision not to step in as the state and prevent that from happening, either with military or police forces.
Which is pretty much the situation that we have in most of our urban centers right now, where there are large tracts of land right next to prime real estate that have been turned into squatter camps.
Yes.
And
no one's doing
anything about it. The state turns a blind eye
because,
to
of course, we would violate the human rights of those people by moving them, Kanthan.
Yes,
is that not the case?
And of course, we won't mention the name of the person who funds the NGOs that ultimately are responsible for these court cases.
Yes, but let's go back to your rhymes
point.
with an orange drink you might have,
yes, yeah.
Or your children might like. Okay, so that's just the context. I think that's important. So obviously the bill is wrong-headed. The state should be able to run some sort of expropriation, very limited, very incredibly limited. It should be able to be challenged in the courts. The sort of burden of proof should always be on the state that they absolutely have to do this. So these kinds of laws should be you need to be very careful if they exist at all. Some more libertarian-leaning people would say they shouldn't exist at all. But you understand why they might need to if you're building a large highway.
But the fascinating thing in this regard, by the way, communist China, there are many cases where people have actually claimed eminent domain, and the Chinese basically built the roads around them.
Yes. Yeah. So there was a very viral photo.
There's quite a few of these. It's not a once-off thing. And I find that actually quite interesting because, the
You'd
entire...
imagine the Chinese would just bulldoze through people.
Exactly.
Not even ask questions.
Yes, and in fact, you have a few examples of those actually happening out there. I know that similar things, because, of course, in the U.S., these rules will vary from state to state. And, so there are some states where it's easier to actually go through this process of, building a freeway than it is in other places. But yes, let's get back to your point because we're digressing.
No,
I'm digressing.
I love the digression.
Yeah.
I think it's important because there's a lot here. Right, so the bill shouldn't exist. That's the context of the bill in terms of what existed and what we have now. Obviously, there's a lot of concern because of where this bill came out of. The argument around, the spurious argument, whites own all the land. They don't. They own about 20%.
So let me just, swing back a bit. The immediate question that comes to mind for me that people have not been asking is, what problem is this bill going to solve that was not solvable under previous law? Mm-hmm. And I've not had a clear answer to that.
There isn't one.
Yes, and that is the specific
Can you
point.
explain why there isn't one? Otherwise, I can.
Okay, go for it.
So, the explanation for why there isn't one is because the Constitution calls for restitution inside the Constitution.
Yes.
Okay? There's a lot of social justice language, which I don't personally like, but it's in there in the Constitution. Right? It's why when this bill gets challenged at the Constitutional Court, they may not overturn it because there's a lot of wording. In fact, the preamble to the Constitution speaks about the wrongs of the past and righting those wrongs, etc. So, and it
speaks about social justice rather than justice.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay, and our justices are mostly left wing, so. In the interpretation we've always had up until this point, our Constitutional Court tends to lean very left. We basically have a Constitutional Court full of Ruth Bader Ginsburgs, okay, and we've got actual text. The constitutional text would be very comfortable in a social justice class today.
Well, let's remember that it was Dikgang Moseneke who effectively codified BEE into law, effectively legalizing racism.
Yeah, so there's examples of this as we go along. So. Firstly, I think that context is quite important. But the other thing is that we've had land restitution that has been managed by the state, the land bank, in fact, which has been managed by the state, I think, for over 20 years now. And the whole point of that was to take vast tracts of land, some which are given up by private individuals who turn around and go, here's land I'm actually giving to the state, or here's land I'm willing to sell to the state. And in many cases, just state-owned land because the state actually owns the majority of land in the country. And the whole point was to then have people apply and say, look, my ancestry comes from here. These are the justifications for why I believe I should be given land. And then they're meant to be given land. Now, as with everything in this country managed by government, that has been managed very poorly. So there's been a lot of corruption, and essentially there's been very little distribution of the land, even though it's already enshrined within the law, which is why you can't get an answer to your question. The other aspect to it is that in most instances, and this has been widely reported on, even in the liberal papers, in most instances, when you offer people money or land,
they take the money.
Would you like 2 million rands worth of land, or would you like 2 million rand in cash? They take the cash. That's what they do. Now, that might be a good thing. That might be a bad thing. I'm not placing judgment on it. I'm just saying that's what happens. So that's why I think you can't get an answer to your question, because this isn't solving a problem. And so then the question comes in is, if it's not solving a problem, is it really going to be used? So a lot of people believing we're going to become Zimbabwe 2.0 overnight, or land is just going to be repossessed. The farmlands are all going to, our farming community is going to collapse. I just don't see that happening. Now, my worry is we should still object to the bill and the act on the basis that we now have an act which allows it to happen. So if you get a madman into a position of power who believes, Cyril's not this guy, by the way, he's a bad guy, he's a communist, but he's not going to come and take all your land tomorrow, just because he doesn't really have the testicular fortitude that you referred to earlier to do that. However, we don't know who will come next. Paul Mashatile might be that guy. Personally, I don't think he is, but he might be that guy. Julius Malema is probably going to be absorbed back into the ANC within the next 2 years. Could he end up president in 10 years' time? Sure. He could also be that guy. So you don't want a law like this on your books for that reason.
Yeah, basically the idea is that you should always look at any law through the lens of what's the worst possible thing that could happen as a result of this law.
What would my enemies do with this law? My worst enemy. That is how you should...
against me.
Against
Absolutely,
me.
yes.
That's how you should assess any
Always,
law, if
yes.
it's a good law.
Yes. And if you'd be unhappy with that law being turned against you, then
Okay,
that's
so
the reason to actually...
That's background.
Yeah.
What about the other aspect, which I think people are missing out on, which is this isn't just about land. The concept
it's about
of
all
private
property, yes.
You know, so Kanthan, I like that water that you're drinking over there. I think I'll take it. That's your property.
I think more crucially, it comes down to businesses. So you're running a successful business, and someone in government decides, well, actually, taking your business is in the national interest, and we're going to do it.
So I'll give you a good example. ArcelorMittal.
Mm-hmm.
That business has not been doing well. That business says they're going to close down. That business is in the national interests because not only does it supply steel to our building industry, but it also supplies steel to our car industry. Our car industry is massive. We build cars for Mercedes, for BMW, for Volkswagen, for Toyota. So we are a car manufacturing country. If we can't get steel, we can't build cars. And we'll probably import the steel, but that makes the input costs greater. And as a result, those factories might close. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of connected jobs. The government might turn around and say, we can't let you close, but we also can't trust you. So we're taking over ArcelorMittal. It's now a state-owned enterprise. And under the Act, they could do that.
Yes.
So, you know, that is a concern I think people have missed out on. And if you look at a place like Venezuela, that's what caused a lot of problems in Venezuela. There were all the usual suspects operating in Venezuela, Shell, BP, Esso, I think. And the Venezuelan government turned around and said, we're going to nationalize these entities because the oil is our resource. You are stealing it and profiteering, and we know better. And us politicians who've never run a business in our life before will be much better at knowing how to run oil refineries and get it out of the ground or the seabed. And so that's what happened. And they collapsed their economy in doing so.
So you put this in the South African context, though. You recognize that to a large extent, the oil companies in particular have already started that pull-out process. Okay, so Caltex pulled out. They sold their interest to
What became Astron.
to China, which then became Astron. Remember that the Caltex refinery in Cape Town was destroyed and was not rebuilt. You have Sapref down in Durban, which was jointly owned by Shell and BP.
What a shame.
Which is now shut down. And the reason why that is shut down is because the government asked them, Shell and BP, to invest $4 billion to ensure that the emissions from the plant were clean. And Shell and BP said, sorry, we don't have a hope in hell of ever making that money back here, so we're out. And so it was shut down. And you know, to the point that you were making
So
with
that's
regard...
environmentalism directly killing...
But to the point you were making with regard
jobs.
to the impact of steel, for example, being taken out of the market. The fact that we killed those refineries and we are now importing fuel directly instead of importing crude oil and refining it ourselves, it means immediately that a range of industries that were dependent on byproducts of refining have shut down or drastically scaled back as a direct result. So, you know, consider plastics, cosmetics, all of these things.
Consider pretty much everything in your life.
Yeah, they're all byproducts of crude oil.
You come into contact with a byproduct of a fossil fuel probably every couple of seconds of your existence. There is no way to get around it. You can drive an electric car and you're still sitting in something made out of fossil fuels. I think that's an important point to raise because it's not raised enough on both sides of this argument, which is this isn't just about tracts of land. This isn't just about giving people land restitution or whatever your argument might be for that, whether you're for or against. This has nothing to do with that. If tonight all of the white people who owned the land signed title deeds over, and suddenly all the land owned by white people was owned by black people, that wouldn't change. It would have obviously impacts, but it wouldn't change the fact that the government could still come for almost everything else. And here's an interesting, so let's go to the throw forward part, because this is something I don't think people have considered. At the moment, you've given the government the power to take away any private property from any private citizen. Okay? So maybe it starts by taking back the land. Okay, now, to me, you can't take something back that wasn't stolen, and I don't believe the majority of land in this country was stolen. Most people paid fair price for it, etc. But assuming you do believe that, and you take it all back, that's okay. What do you think happens to the Zulus who own land in the Eastern Cape? What do you think happens to the Xhosas who own land in Mpumalanga and Limpopo?
I think you meant the KwaZulu-Natal first, as opposed to the Eastern Cape.
Well, I'm saying if you are, you see, this is a race to the bottom. So at the moment, it's easy to go after the usual boogeyman.
So the fascinating thing is that MK has stepped up and said that they're against this.
Yeah, their statement was shit though, because the reasons were not.
No. Let's be very clear. Okay, have MK statements ever been clear in terms of? But what's very clear is they fundamentally oppose the legislation, and it makes sense because the entire Ingonyama trust would then be up for expropriation, and they clearly don't want that.
Well, potentially, but what I'm saying is maybe you come along and you go, well, we've got rid of the white problem, and the whites don't own any more land. And this is not an unreasonable. In 50 years' time, the majority of land in this country will not be owned by white people. Okay, it currently isn't, but that 20% also won't be owned by white people. And at some point, it's going to become a completely ridiculous statement to say white people this or white people that, because there just aren't going to be very many of them. Let me
interrupt for a second there. I'm curious as to how you make that prediction that it won't be owned by white people. How do you figure?
I just look at demographics, which are, as you have pointed out, destiny.
So you work on the assumption that let's say if white-colored and Indian population kind of maintain their current levels, which means that their consumption of land will continue to be at current levels. So, yes, it's highly probable that there'll be an increase in the overall percentage that's owned owned by people who are not white-colored and Indian. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be a reduction in the...
Well, 100% being competed for has to, and if we agree that one group increases greater than another group and they're all competing for the same resource.
But they're not necessarily. And
perhaps.
And again, if you look in terms of, just simply and using the Greater Johannesburg area as an example, the number of new developments, the number of new gated communities that continue to spring up literally on a day-by-day basis. We certainly for that type of market, if you're looking at those who are competing directly with the middle-class market, let's treat farmland separately, because I think that we need to look at the logistics of that in a different category. But, certainly the middle-class housing market, the amount of available middle-class housing has actually continued to grow and is in terms of these urban centers, is pretty much thriving to a large extent.
Yeah.
So I'm just
but
making
it's not a white population thriving. It's a white population living there, thriving potentially. But what I'm pointing out, and we know this, the black middle
the white
class.
population is not growing in size.
When the black population is, and the black population will hopefully continue to, the middle class will hopefully continue to grow. And the only way that's happening, by the way, is with black people entering the middle class, which, as you know, I'm very pro happening. And so ultimately, I think these gated communities you talk about, for example, already are, but will ultimately be, they already are about 60%.
Well, they already are.
60%
because
black
consider
versus
that
white.
the black middle class has actually exceeded the size of
Well
white Canadians
exceeded.
decades ago.
Yes. So I just think what I'm saying is, if you run this on a long enough scale, maybe it's not 50, maybe it's 100. It doesn't really matter. I don't, I can be very concerned about my personal lifetime, but I can also be realistic about what's likely things will look like in 100 or 200 years.
But the crucial point I think you're building up to is that black people who think that the state will not come after them.
I'm talking about I'm talking about tribalism because at the moment the boogeyman is the white guy. It's just how our politics have been done. It's how our media has been done. At some point, it'll be impossible to make the white dude the boogeyman, right? Because it just won't be enough of them, relatively speaking. All right? And so then what happens is you're going to find other boogeymen. And that's probably going to be tribal, because that's how the path every country that goes down this terrible path follows. And when that happens, well, if the guy in charge is a Zulu guy, maybe he expropriates, he turns around and goes, listen, your tribe doesn't come from this particular area. So I'm going to take away the land because that land shouldn't belong to you. All right? Or, I don't like the fact that your tribe actually runs a lot of the banks. I've noticed that you guys are the CEOs, and not a big fan of that. I'd rather my tribe were, because that's all this comes down to. So you at some point you've got to pick, you've got to choose. Either you're colorblind and you're completely blind to all of this stuff, and you don't care. You're merit based, and whoever gets wherever they get, you assume they got there through good means, and if they didn't, use the criminal law to prevent them from proceeding further. Or you go down the path we're going down, where we refuse to accept that merit is allowed, and everyone must have got there wherever they are because they had a step up over you, and then they need to be brought down a peg or 10 pegs or whatever. And so this is a race to the bottom. And I think that that's what is so silly about a law like this is it's the same with Bella. The Bella argument was made, and again, I agree with him. I'm not belittling this argument or the people who make it, but the point is the Bella argument was made. Bella's bad because it's going to prevent certain language instruction in certain schools. So if you had an Afrikaans school, that's not going to be allowed anymore because Bella is going to mean anyone can come to the school, and then you're going to have to, by the Constitution, essentially teach in multiple languages because not fair to exclude children from education. Now, that's one argument, and I hear that argument. My bigger concern with Bella was broader than that, because it's not just about the language. That's a part of it. The broader thing about Bella is what it's going to do is it's going to reduce the quality of education across the board. And it's going to give government central control of education. And so, once again, we're having the what is it going to do in the next year, 2 years, 5 years argument. And I'm having the what is it going to do in 20, 30, 40 years argument.
Well, we've already seen the practical implications, which we spoke about last time, which is that you have kids now being assigned arbitrarily to schools without the consent of their parents based on the languages that are being taught there. So you had this very pissed off non-Afrikaans speaking black woman who was hugely irritated at the fact that her kid had been placed in an Afrikaans medium school.
Understandably, right? Sorry, Kanthan's just dying. Give him a chance there. Yeah, understandably that she was upset.
So let's backtrack a bit right now in terms of the potential scenarios. I'm again going to go back to the question of I want to see what use case they've actually got planned for it under the current administration. Okay. And It's one of those things where we're waiting to see where the thin edge of the wedge is going to be, because what's probably going to happen is that they're going to pick something that looks relatively obscure, and they'll use it. Yeah. And it's the boiling the frog scenario, which we're familiar with. And I guess we need to look at where the first use case is going to be in terms of this law.
Yeah. I mean, if they're smart, right, they'll do something where they go, this is the disused mine on the periphery of some city, for example. No one's been there in 40 years.
But here's the interesting thing in terms of that stuff, which again, people don't realize, that in terms of current law, so let's say, for example, you discover oil on your property, John.
Yeah, it's not mine.
You don't own that oil.
Well, that's a bad ruling that most people just didn't even know happened at the Constitutional Court a few years ago. It's about 4 or 5 years ago. They ruled, it used to be, if you drilled down and discovered oil, or your land was particularly, there was some resource, water, whatever it was that you found, it used to automatically be yours. You had the claim.
Well, riparian rights, yes, but mining claims, no. I mean, for the longest time under South African law, and this dates back to the time of Rhodes, that, yes, your property is yours, but the mineral wealth that lies beneath that soil is not yours.
Yeah. So, and they, bless you.
Thank you.
Something you're allergic to today.
No, I think it's just a combination of the air conditioner tickling my nose and
right.
Yes, but anyway.
So, all right, I hear you, but I do think they will, but to your point, I do think they will choose something relatively benign where they know that there will be no one will mind. No one will mind. You find some tract of land somewhere that doesn't, no one cares. Maybe it's a deceased estate, or who knows. Maybe it's an abandoned mine, or whatever it happens to be. And they just turn around and go, well, we're expropriating this, and we're going to make it a housing settlement. And that's for the benefit of the people who need housing. And everyone will agree. Most people will go, great idea. You should definitely do that. And I think that's probably where it will be exercised. I think that business may be another area where it is exercised sooner than we think.
Do you notice that you and I are not even remotely considering the possibility that the courts will overturn this?
Okay, so you brought that up. What do you think the DA is going to do? Firstly, can we just talk about what the DA has done? I mean, they are. It's just I don't have the words right now. You go.
So what's kind of very clear to me is that the ministers, for example, the DA ministers, are fundamentally unaware of the fact that theirs is the power in terms of whether or not things get implemented in a particular way. And it was very clear from the way in which, firstly, the education minister was talking about the Bella Bill, and now more recently in terms of the way in which Dean McPherson has been talking about this particular bill. That there's this fundamental lack of understanding that if the minister refuses to comply, Ramaphosa then basically has the choice of backing down or firing the minister. Which
do you think it's completely by chance or by plan that the Bella Bill went to a minister who is a DA minister? The EWC bill is going to a minister who is a DA minister.
Yes.
I mean, that seems, of 2 out of the 3 of the most controversial bills, and 2 out of 2 of the ones passed since the election.
Yes.
Okay, so the third one would be NHI.
NHI, yes.
But NHI is a different story because it's Aaron Motsoaledi's pet project, and they are full guns blazing on it. But it seems to me that seems like either a massive coincidence or is completely part of a greater plan, that they did that on purpose and knew it was coming. I mean, your take?
Look, I think that would give credit the ANC's planning committees with too much foresight to be able to make a call on this. Because, on the one hand, you've got to be able to plan that out. And,
you just don't think they're good enough to do that.
So on the one hand, you have to plan it out. On the other hand, you have to count on the DA ministers being so weak that they will not publicly challenge it, and instead wait for the slow process of bureaucracy to actually play itself out. So in this particular case, both of these ministers have, they've fallen back on, we are awaiting instructions from within our structures. That's the fundamental response, as opposed to...
Okay, so it's more of a blunder than anything else, and it just so happens that the DA ended up in those positions.
No, it's not a blunder. You see, the reason why I say it's not a blunder is because these are both things that are fundamentally against the principles of the DA. And really all we needed in both of these cases were for the ministers to be standing up and saying, these are fundamentally against the principles that we stand for and under which we entered this government of national unity. And until such time as I'm actually required to do so differently by my party, I will be refusing to implement these, and I will await instructions from my party in this regard. Done and dusted. Immediately people are saying, okay.
And then balls back in the ANC's court.
Yes, and there's a face-off, and now your move, Cyril. But that was not done.
And then we know Cyril has to be decisive, and he can't be decisive.
He cannot be decisive, yes. So that was not done. It was just the most basic level of not having the ability to actually make a decision. And, we've seen this play itself out on the global stage at so many levels. And that's why, just to use a very specific example, you have this face-off. I want to touch on this very briefly that Trump had with the Colombians with regard to illegal immigrants being sent back to that country. So just to recap very briefly, Trump sent 2 plane loads of immigrants. Well, let's not call them immigrants. Let's call them invaders, because they basically crossed the borders illegally. But anyway, he rounded them up, put them on Air Force planes, and sent them across to Colombia. Government of Colombia refused to allow the planes to land. Within a couple of hours of the Colombian government refusing to allow the planes to land, Trump had immediately acted to pass sweeping sanctions against the government of Colombia, recall their ambassador, and did a whole range of things that would have immediate, severe financial consequences. Mm-hmm. And again, within a couple of hours...
Less than 2 hours.
Less than 2 hours, yes. Again,
the Colombians backed down.
The Colombians backed down. And understand, this was all done while Trump was on the golf course. He was playing a round of golf. They came to him and they said that the Colombians are misbehaving. He said, do this. And by the time he went to the 9th hole, the Colombians had already surrendered. And it was all a question of having a politician who is aware of what his responsibilities are, what his powers are in terms of those responsibilities, and fundamentally having the ability to then act within those powers and actually do what needs to be done. Now, previous administrations, in fact, governments around the world, what they do is they refer it back to committees, they get legal advice and all of that kind of stuff, which is exactly what the people that you are fighting against want to do, because that allows them to get a foothold and strengthens their position while you are discussing things in committee.
So the question then from me is, why is John Steenhuisen an even weaker character than Cyril Ramaphosa? Because surely what should have happened here is Cyril assents to that bill. I'll note he assented to it, which means he approved it, but he didn't, he as far as I understand, he didn't, there's assent and consent, as far as I understand. And so in other words, he didn't agree or disagree. He just said fine and let it pass his desk, but he didn't give it his stamp of approval, as far as I understand, within our system. I'm willing to be community noted on that, by the way.
But he did actually sign the bill.
Yeah, but as far as I understand, there's a difference. But put that to the side. Cyril signs the bill, it becomes an act. John and Helen, what are they doing? I know Helen is a stronger person than this. What are they doing? The bill gets signed. They then don't know what to do. They come out and go, well, it's the GNU is an important partnership, and we don't want to lose the partnership, but also this is against our principles, but we're not going to really react just yet. We'll take our time with our lawyers. What is that? What is that? That's not, it's not anything. It's not smart politics. It's not for the benefit of the country. It's not for the benefit of their party. They helped no one. I cannot tell you, and this is obviously anecdotal, but I can tell you based on their reaction in the days which followed that it must be true. The DA works on polling. This is how the DA manages their structures, right? So it's an interesting thing. During the sort of Tony Leon to Helen Zille phase, they didn't give a shit what anyone else thought of them. And they did what they thought was right. And they grew the party. And then they did that whole Musi phase post-Helen, with Helen in the background, but a whole bunch of communication consultants, etc., involved in the upper echelons and structures, and a whole bunch of political consultants as well. People who've been around for far too long, who don't know what they're doing. They have read Francis Fukuyama way too many times. And they basically run that party currently by committee and poll. So what will happen is they will constantly poll issues amongst what they believe is the electorate or their base, and then they will decide how to react rather than just reacting on an issue based on whether it's right or wrong. Rather going, you know what, Helen, you're a smart woman. You've been around long enough. What do you think? Forget what the people think, because sometimes the people are wrong. Forget what the consultants say, because almost always the consultants are wrong. So that's how they run that party.
But here's the point. The DA has shown that they're able to do that under specific circumstances. So, for example, on the question of Israel and the ICJ, there were very firm pronouncements on the part of the DA. Certainly a lot more vocal than the DA has been around the current matters at hand.
Well, sort of. I mean, I think the record will show that the Freedom Front Plus, for example, was far more inverted commas vocal.
But that's the case right now on these bills as well.
Sure. And the ACDP was far more vocal on that particular topic. The DA tried to split the baby on that one and not upset the Muslims, but also not upset the Jews. But I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that. What the point I'm making is, when Cyril signs that bill, John knows how to react to that. John is a classical liberal. He knows how to react to that. Helen is even more so. She knows how to react to that. And then they react completely inappropriately, lily-livered, with no firm pronouncements, basically begging to keep the government together. Oh no, we'll lose our ministries. Oh no, our nice salaries. Who knows? Oh no, our place. Oh no, our funders want us to stay together.
Well, look, to be fair, I haven't heard them say that, we're going to lose our ministries. And the boogeyman that they keep hitting us with is that, well, if we don't have this alliance with the ANC, then it's going to be an ANC-MK alliance, and that's going to be an absolute disaster. And I have to go back and say, people, that ANC-MK alliance is exactly the ANC that we've lived under as a majority party for 30 years.
But you and I have been saying this since the election. The reality is that if the MK and the ANC formed a government tomorrow, the GNU ended, and there was a new GNU, or whatever they ended up calling it, the reality would be that is just the ANC of 2016.
Correct.
There is no difference. The only difference would be you would be shuffling the chairs around in terms of who sat in which position.
And it's very clear that Ramaphosa would not be president under that arrangement.
Correct, which he wasn't in 2016.
Yes.
And so, and that was the big power fight that happened with removing Zuma, who ended up in the prime position. Oh, turns out Ramaphosa. So, this sort of fear-mongering over, the MK this, The MK is the ANC, folks. The people in the MK, go look at all their members. They're all former ANC people. There's nobody in there that is particularly scary in the sense that they're an unknown entity. You know exactly what you're dealing with. Now, I get it. You don't want another 2016 ANC running the place. But you might get that anyway. And the anecdote I was referring to and the polling I was speaking to, and the reason why the tone changed, is because from my side, the number of people that I've come across who feel completely betrayed by the DA and feel that the DA has completely lost their way is through the roof. And I can see that the polling...
I'm inclined to believe that.
Well, their polling must show that, because they had this lily-livered wet response for the first 48 hours. And then they came out a little bit more forcefully in the past couple of days. Still not good enough, in my opinion, but certainly more forcefully. And that's completely because they're being driven by polling rather than just being driven by principle. And the principle here should have been very simple. We're not going to put this into place at all. We run the ministry, so the answer is no. And not only that, we're going to do other things to either leave the GNU or to hurt you back in the GNU the same way you've tried to hurt us. You know, that's the way you respond. You take it to the ANC. Listen, as you say, Cyril ain't going to be the president if the ANC has to be in government with anyone else. Here's a thing the DA could do. Go to Parliament and call for a motion of no confidence in Cyril. I don't know where that ends you up. Okay, maybe the ANC leaves the GNU on that basis. Maybe they don't. Maybe a whole bunch of people in the ANC lick their chops and go, okay, and a whole bunch of the people in MK vote with you, and Cyril isn't president anymore. And then you still have a GNU with Paul Mashatile as president. Worse, I don't know.
So what you're describing, I think, is still a possible scenario, because the way I'm reading the entire public meltdown right now and the sense of betrayal that you speak about, and it's very real. You know, normally what happens is when the DA does something that is slightly out of line, you will have the usual assortment of fanboys and fangirls who will step up and say, no, the DA is still committed to the following principles and they are still the best
best alternative.
The best alternative,
That's
the most
it.
competent, the most efficient
Yeah.
government. Look how well we run the Western Cape. And you're not seeing any of that this time around, because normally that's the first thing that people turn around and kind of hit you over the head with. I'm not seeing all of those people. There's this kind of silence from the people who would normally be stepping up and saying that. So it's very possible that by the time you and I have our next conversation, that has in fact happened, that the DA steps up and calls for a motion of no confidence in Ramaphosa, and as a result breaks the terms of the GNU, so they step out from the GNU.
I don't think they have the balls for it.
Well, I think that if you are correct about the polling, as you seem to think you are, I'm pretty clear that the polling right now will be showing that the current course of action is going to be utterly disastrous. And therefore, just take the view that we are 2025 now. The major fight that they're going to need to have is going to be the 2026 municipal elections. So,
do you think that's a big fight? I think that's completely overrated. Do you think that's a big fight?
I think it's a big fight. And I think it's a big fight because it's the first time that the ANC is going to be contesting those elections, effectively being a minority party in nearly all the major municipalities. And they're going to be going head to head with. So right now, the ANC is a minority party in Johannesburg based on the previous municipal elections. So, in other words, they were able to cram together, to build together a coalition to hold the city of Johannesburg, in spite of the fact that they're a minority. But remember that MK was not part of the equation at that time. So you're going to have asset stripping that takes place of the voting base of the ANC by MK come the next election. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be fairly substantial. So if I was sitting in the DA's position right now, and I'm taking a look at these figures that are coming out, that's showing that confidence in this party has dropped so drastically, from where it was at the, prior to the elections last year, that there's every incentive at this point to actually say, okay, we're pulling out from the GNU. What happens as a result? It doesn't even need to be calling for the removal of Ramaphosa. Okay, it can't just simply be a withdrawal from the GNU. So two things then happen as a result. The ANC then becomes a minority government, okay, which to my mind is a good thing, because it means then that if they want to pass a budget next year, for example, they will need to do so with the approval of either the DA or of MK, because there's no other way that they can actually pull it together.
Just explain how that happens, because my understanding is if the DA pulls out of the GNU,
yes,
the ANC's then got, as you say, a minority of votes.
Yes.
Okay, 40%, but less than 50. My understanding is that they would then need to climb into bed with someone to get back up over 50. You're saying that the government stays in place.
Yes.
With the assent of the other parties, that they can stay in place, but obviously everything has to run through some sort of parliamentary committee.
Well, not parliamentary committee, but so the most fundamental thing we need to worry about is the budget, okay, or any piece of legislation. So for any piece of legislation to pass, you need to have 50% plus one.
I agree, but don't we have that already?
No.
See, if we let them have a minority government, they'd still run every single ministry, and the ministries would do whatever they like.
They would run every single ministry, but for any new legislation to be passed.
Yeah.
Okay. So new legislation, let's remove the ANC and MK, let's remove the DA and MK from the numbers.
Yeah.
So even if you cram all of the other parties together, the ANC will barely scrape past the 50% mark. Whereas if either either MK or the DA votes with the ANC, then everything passes, because they both got enough numbers to get them over the 50% mark. Right now, if you take the EFF and the ANC together, the two of them, they don't make 50%. So,
but they don't need much to get there. ATM and those types of parties.
No, but even those rats and mice parties, it's not enough to comfortably push them over the 50% mark. And what is the ANC going to be able to offer those parties in order to get to that stage, other than trying to pull them into the GNU? And you remember that there's a whole bunch of them that don't want to be part of the GNU. But the crucial thing that I'm trying to get at is it would actually be in the interests of the DA at this point to be withdrawing from the GNU. That will immediately earn them brownie points with their voting base. I'm very clear about that.
So they went on this big marketing campaign and called the anything but them and the ANC a doomsday coalition.
Yes.
And I think that was a wrong-headed marketing campaign, but effective. And I think most people who are their voters, not everyone else, but most people who are voting for the DA or who are sympathetic to the DA will have digested that doomsday coalition and may view the DA removing themselves from the GNU as also a betrayal. And this is the rock and the hard place that they find themselves in now.
I don't know if any single person, and understand that I know lots of DA voters.
Sure.
Okay, because, certainly within my the immediate circle of people that I engage with on a day-to-day basis, there's almost no ANC voters left. And nearly all of them have ended up voting for the DA. Some people have done really stupid things like voting for Action SA or Rise Mzansi, but
incredibly dumb.
Yes, but fundamentally they've ended up voting for the DA. And right now, is there a sense on the part of any of those people that I speak to, and yes, of course, this is anecdotal. Please don't ratio me in the comment section. Is there right now, anyone who believes that continuing to be in the GNU is in the best interests of the country. I'm hard-pressed to find people who actually believe that's the case.
Yeah. I don't know. I think the problem is when you sell narratives, which are exactly that. They're not truth. They're just narratives. There was no such thing as a doomsday coalition.
Right.
You could argue that the ANC and the DA are the doomsday coalition because what's happened is we've got more socialist communist policy that's come out of the GNU than we had from Jacob Zuma's entire government.
Correct.
Okay. So in my opinion, that's more of a doomsday government than we had before.
And more crucially, because of the fact that the DA is no longer in opposition, they're no longer in a position to criticize that stuff in terms of the agreements that they've drawn up around the GNU because, they're part of it now.
Yeah.
And
so you sell that narrative, right? That's on the one side. And then the other narrative you sell after this all happens is, well, the ANC is bad and they're coming for private property. And the problem is that maybe you're right. Maybe enough people are like, okay, that's a bridge too far. And we're fine with the doomsday coalition. But they might blame the DA. The other problem the DA has is that a lot of their input is coming from their funders who've basically told them, listen, go into coalition with the ANC, show that you do good things in the departments where you're involved, grow your support in that way. And then in around 2028, you can leave the GNU with about a year to go where it doesn't make a difference. No one blames you because it's a year before elections. Everyone can feel change coming. And then what you can do is you can criticize the ANC heavily for a year. The ANC will love it because they're going to do exactly the same thing. They're going to criticize you heavily to try and get their base back. And then when 29 comes, maybe you end up with 30, right? And you can actually be the power play. Maybe the ANC drops low enough, or the other people have enough that added together you're willing to go into some sort of coalition with them. That was the original plan. That was what was meant to happen.
So look, I think that you're 100% right in terms of the overall impact that the funders are having on both the DA and the ANC. Because I'm very clear that at the upper echelons, you have the same funders effectively pouring money into Ramaphosa's side of the equation as well as the DA side of the equation. And it's very clear that MK is not getting any of that funding. So the question right now in terms of why the DA is so desperately clinging to its particular perch right now, yes, funding to my mind is a significant chunk of that. But there's a huge cost that comes with that. And the cost, as you've pointed out, is the lack of the ability to cling to a principal position, which, so immediately at the point at which you are in, basically at the mercy of the donors, that's the point at which the voters start actually recognizing that you're not acting in the interests of the principles that the voting base actually wanted in the first place. Mm-hmm. And the voters then become disillusioned. And then, of course, the voters don't necessarily go and vote for someone else, but they just simply stay away from the polls, which has, the overall impact of, continuing to diminish the base that you had. So, but let's just make a prediction at this point, okay? And I'm taking the view that if the DA is as serious about the polling as you say, and if they have to weigh that up against the money that they're getting from the donors, is this the point at which they can actually tell the donors, sorry, we've actually got to draw a line in the sand? In this one, I think the answer to that is probably yes, which means that probably within a couple of weeks, you could see a situation where the DA withdraws from the GNU and goes back to becoming the official opposition. The answer, they don't need a vote of no confidence in Ramaphosa. I don't think they want to replace Ramaphosa with Mashatile, but they simply withdraw from the GNU. Ramaphosa becomes a minority government. Ramaphosa will effectively not be able to pass any legislation without the consent of either the DA or MK. MK is not going to support Ramaphosa at any level. Would MK do so if Mashatile was in power? Absolutely. But as things stand right now, Ramaphosa will effectively become a lame duck president because he will not be able to do anything without the consent of the DA. So even though the DA themselves will not be holding those ministerial positions, as the official opposition, they will hold the power to be able to hold them to
except
account.
that power doesn't excite me. And the reason it doesn't excite me is because the issue we have is not the laws that are going to come. I'm sure there will be plenty of terrible ones. The issues we have are the laws we have on the books, including the new ones that have come along.
But we've already agreed that the DA is powerless to in any way affect that. But the crucial thing, John, and we have to come back to this, is that the ANC cannot run the country unless they pass a budget. And they will not be able to pass a budget unless they have the consent of either of those two
I
parties.
hear you, but
and I'm saying
the budget
that,
will pass at some level.
No, it
Kanthan.
won't. It won't.
What do you mean? They'll just sit on it in Parliament and say we refuse to pass the budget.
Exactly.
And then what happens?
And then there's no money.
The government shuts down.
And then the government shuts down. There is no money.
Kanthan, I love what you're describing. I understand. I'm not arguing with you on a basis of.
Look, understand what I'm saying right now is that if I was the person who was running the DA, that's the approach that I would be taking because I recognize.
Paralyze the government.
Yeah, paralyze the government because Ramaphosa is not going to jeopardize his position because that means putting Mashatile in. So the boogeyman of MK is not going to be able to go into partnership with Ramaphosa because let's be very clear, Zuma wants Ramaphosa out of there. He wants to humiliate Ramaphosa because he correctly sees Ramaphosa as the architect of his own demise. So, yes, I think that puts the DA in a far more powerful position than, right now the token scenario where you have a handful of ministries. And the truth of the matter is you haven't actually done anything with those ministries other than to make home affairs slightly more efficient. That's it.
And a debate about whether that's actually true at all.
Yes.
Because some stories I'm hearing where it doesn't seem to be much more efficient, maybe worse. Others where maybe it's slightly more efficient. I love the idea. Don't get me wrong. I just don't think we have the type of politicians you're talking about. I mean, John looks like a broken man.
Correct, yeah. You see, let's just admit that, the likes of Steenhuisen, I used to actually go out to bat for McPherson. It's very clear for me that, to me now as well, that he's completely ineffectual. Who do they actually have?
Dean never saw an idea that someone else had and implemented that he didn't think he could claim for himself. That's Dean McPherson's entire grift.
Well, you see, my point is that you need people who, at the end of the day, have that thing about looking presidential. And I keep coming back to this particular drum over and over again. And you look back at the history of DA leaders, let's be very clear about the fact that whatever you might think of Tony Leon always was presidential. Okay, he walked into a room.
I'm going to one-up it.
Yes.
Because I don't like the idea of presidential because it's a subjective sort of viewing of someone. I prefer the action that tends to take, okay? So they're able to wield power, okay? And that is something
and
I don't believe.
When I speak about being presidential, that's exactly what I'm talking about. When the person enters the room, do people pay attention?
I want you to bear in mind that many people who don't think like you and I would say that Biden was presidential and Trump isn't.
Not at all.
Okay. So I think definitions here are very important.
And as a very specific example, you look at what it was like when Trump, during his first term, went to meet with the Europeans, and he basically immediately took center stage. Forcefully, okay, and made it very clear, guys, understand that I'm in charge here. Biden, on the other hand, was kind of relegated to the back row in the pictures. That's what I'm talking about when I say being presidential. Tony Leon would not allow people to push him to the back. Helen Ziller would not allow people to push her to the back.
Until she got completely rolled over on the Singapore issue. And
understand,
she has never recovered from that campaign.
By the time the Singapore issue came along, she was already stepping down from leadership positions within the party. So you can't really blame her at that point for not, acting presidential when she didn't have presidential ambitions at that stage. Remember that when this entire Singapore debacle came, Musi Maimano had already been anointed as the leader of the party.
Yeah.
He did the fundamentally stupid thing of then attacking the person who put him in place, which immediately showed him up to be a person of excellent stature to pull those together.
Well, I mean, he threw his wife under the bus, so he has no integrity. That guy.
Yes. So I think it's unfair to say that Helen at that point could have done anything different. Because at that point, Maimane being the leader of the party, it would have been untoward for her to actually then have a public spat with him.
I think, though, Kanthan,
but let's go back to the bugbears that you and I have right now. In that, I don't think there's anyone in the DA establishment right now that I can look to and say this is a person I respect. In any of the people that they currently have in Parliament.
I agree. I think that there are moments and situations and experiences that happen to people that change them, and in some ways that break their spirits. And I think that the Singapore thing broke Helen's spirit. And I do not think she's been the same since. I still think she's as smart as she was. And in some ways, she's as politically intelligent as she was, but she is not willing to take the action required to get to the ends because of what happened.
But again, she lacks the structural authority right now to be able to do that. As chairperson of the Federal Council of the DA, in theory, you try and steer the council together to come up with a particular policy standpoint.
I'm not giving her a pass.
Okay.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I tell you why. Because we talk about FedEx, and FedEx is responsible for Ramon and Ronaldo.
Yes.
And she didn't stand up for either of them.
Correct.
And so that shows a beaten woman, in my opinion.
Fair point.
And so then the question is moving on from Helen, because she is at some point going to have to be gone from the structure. And in my opinion, her time is done because she's not the strong woman she once was.
Yes.
She's not the Thatcher type anymore. I think it's within her. I just don't think she puts it out into the world anymore. The question then is who? Because it's not John. He looks completely broken in all those sort of media blitz things he's done in the past week. I don't think it's Jordan, because I don't mind Jordan, frankly. I think he's got potential. And I don't think it's Chris Pappas either, who I also like and think has potential as a politician. But none of these people strike me as what you're talking about, presidential. Take power, use it ruthlessly to get your ends and your aims completed, because that's what you believe in based on your principles. And screw what anyone else says, because all that matters is getting where you think we need to be. And who is that person in the DA? Anyone?
There's no one that comes to mind.
And there's the problem. And there's the problem. And in truth, in South African politics, the only person that comes to mind, and I don't agree with the ends he would implement, is Jacob Zuma.
Yes.
He's the only person who sees power and goes, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to use it. And damn anyone who says otherwise. Now, again, I don't agree with how he would use it, but he is that person. And until we find someone who has principles like those we like in parties like the DA or the Freedom Front Plus or the ACDP or the IFP, until someone like that comes out of the woodwork with roughly the right political principles based in the right philosophy, I don't see any change.
I think this is a good point at which to just touch on the question that was raised on X a couple of days back, where someone was asking what happened in the context of the ZACP.
Yes, I saw that.
Yes, and I said I'd touch upon it.
A recap: the South African Capitalist Party,
the Capitalist
which
Party
you
of South
started.
Africa. Yes, well, I started with a bunch of people, so there were basically 10 of us who pulled it together, and we had essentially 10 candidates, 10 principles, 10 programs of action. And we contested the election in 2019 on that basis. And of course, I was one of them. Roman Kabanak was one of them. There's a whole range of others, and I'm not going to touch on that at this point. But the ideas that we were committed to were basically a lot of the principles that I think you and I still hold dear. Which is, free speech, freedom of association, property rights, gun rights, a whole range of things. A couple of things that came out of that. And understand that we funded this entire thing out of our own pockets. And at the point at which we then tried to get into the fundraising side of things, because, understand that contesting elections is an expensive process. And it was very clear that even though all of us, the 10 of us, had very good contacts among the business community, and there are a lot of people who actually respected us and would gladly support us in a range of business ventures, were not prepared to come to the party simply because of the fact that they were terrified of upsetting the government, because of the fact the government is able to see who various donations are going to. So it immediately meant that we were in a scenario where it was clear that we were never going to be able to raise sufficient funding to be able to carry this thing through to completion. And if anything, the situation that we have right now is significantly worse. And I'm saying this to basically make the point that trying to come up with a credible opposition that is committed to these points of principle is only going to be possible if you're a person like a Donald Trump who actually has enough fuck you money, which means he's prepared to be able to throw it in terms of actually pushing a particular point. You also, it's very much the case with Elon Musk going out to buy Twitter. He goes and drops 44 billion and he buys it because he can afford to do so. So you had that particular combination that was possible there of highly principled people who were pushing an agenda that they believe in, but were then actually able to gain sufficient momentum to be able to take it to market based on the fact that no matter how much money the opposition was throwing at a counter-narrative, they were still able to hold their ground and take themselves to power. And I'm saying basically that anyone who's hoping right now that in the absence of a person who has sufficiently deep pockets and at the same time is not afraid of the government coming after him or her and is prepared to actually bankroll a movement along the lines of MAGA that is going to resonate with people across the entire voting base. And let's be very clear, we can draw specific things right now that will pull this country together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Illegal immigration is one of them.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like it or not.
Yes, illegal.
Like it or not, the reality is that there is way too much of that going on. Those shanty towns that
illegal
you talk
immigration
about,
is way up there. Being soft on crime, which the current government has, is way up there.
100%.
Education as as something that actually works and is able to deliver the masses is way up there. You can get the entire populace to agree on all of this, but you cannot pull together someone who's actually going to be able to fund a political party for this unless we have that person in the country right now. And I don't know of anyone who actually ticks those boxes, because all of the new millionaires that we've had over the past 30 years
are beneficiaries of the ANC.
And they're beneficiaries of the system, and they have no vested interest in any way of changing the system.
I think what's more upsetting for me on that point is that I understand if you are an ANC cadre or linked in some way. Toki Sekwale, I understand him living and dying ANC. Makes perfect sense, right? He was always a member of the party during apartheid. He was then elevated into its ranks. He's come in and out as he pleased, but in the meantime, he's become a billionaire. Why the heck would he ever take money against that party? He wouldn't. I get that. Let's say you're on a smaller scale and under the ANC you managed to get a whole bunch of tenders and you're worth 10 million rand now. Why would you ever go against that party? What I find frustrating and upsetting is that there are a number of people who the ANC openly attacks, who the policies that the ANC advocates for, the acts that it puts into place, are directly targeting, and it may not hurt them, but it certainly will hurt their children at some point, or maybe their grandchildren. I don't know what the time scale is. All of those people give money to the ANC, or at best support a soft and wet version of the DA. And that is what is so frustrating. You see a party like ZACP come up in 2019, doesn't get a seat in parliament, gets close, admittedly, but doesn't get a seat, with no funding, as you say. And then you see a party like Rise Mzansi, basically socialism with rainbow colors. That's what that party stands for. By the way, very happy with the EWC Act.
Yes.
So all you people in Parkhurst that voted for Rise Mzansi, who are, it's unclear whether you actually have any brain cells, but you absolute morons. You see a party like that get 15 million rand at least of injection and end up with 2 or 3 seats in parliament. Okay. This is the problem we have. So it's not only finding a person who can resonate with the public and bring out these points and get enough people behind them, but it's finding people with enough balls with the money. I don't think we're going to find a singular billionaire, because last I checked, Johan Rupert is very apolitical, at least publicly. Right? That's our Donald Trump. Tokyo Sekwale is an ANC guy. That's our Donald Trump. Ramaphosa is a nothing. He's a jellyfish of a man. Okay? So we're not going to find a billionaire who's going to come and give their own. But we could certainly find someone with the right voice. We could find someone with the right voice if they had the right backing. But none of those people who would never have to put themselves on television, but maybe be exposed because of our funding laws that have now changed, so people would know they helped fund the party. None of them are willing to put their money where their mouths in, and they support, through their donations, they support the very people trying to destroy their lives and that of their kids. And that is, there are some evils that are almost understandable. Greed, as an example. It's a human-natured thing. You should try avoid it. But it's understandable that people are greedy. Personally, I think Bill Gates is greedy. That's what I think Bill Gates is. I think everything he does is driven by greed. Evil? Sure. Do I think he's actually personally evil? Wants to personally harm you? No. But I think his greed leads to evil. The greatest evil is doing things knowingly that are going to harm your own offspring, and sitting by and allowing that to occur. And these people in our country who are very wealthy and have the power to do the right thing can't bring themselves to do it. That's evil. Don't know if you've got anything comment on that.
No, I agree completely with it. And but that's the way in which most of the stuff that goes wrong in the world is actually allowed to happen. And we saw this during the Biden administration. The number of people who just silently bent the knee and went about their business as though everything was normal. They, literally normalized the violation of the Bill of Rights in the United States just by their silence.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I go back to COVID because, again, same story. I watched children being trampled over in terms of their rights, in terms of their educations, and nobody cared. Nobody cared. And that is the essence. If you want to see people behaving in an evil manner, that is it right there. It's not merely not caring for yourself or worrying only about self. It's caring so little that your own offspring you are willing to sacrifice at the altar. And you know, that is the situation I think we are in. Maybe pivoting a little bit quickly, because that got very philosophical, but pivoting a little bit to the last thing to discuss, which is at home but comes from the States. Trump has suspended funding for US aid. You might want to Google what US aid stands for. It doesn't stand for aid.
United States Agency for International Development.
That's correct. It's a CIA outfit designed to essentially create networks across the world of influence and power through provision of things like food or medicines. Anyway, he's paused all of this stuff. They've said, look, we're going to look at all the aid that's going out of the States, which is billions of dollars. We're going to look at it, and we're going to see that it aligns with our values. Now, there's a very good chance that aid coming to South Africa will not align with the values of the United States. Not because that aid's not going to worthy people, but because this country doesn't align with the values of the United States. And so the big hit that's happened is USAID and PEPFAR, which fund some. Everyone's very upset when you say that the Americans are funding our ARV program, and then they tell you that it's only funding 20%. Okay, guys, 6 million people are on ARVs. 1 in 5 is funded by an American. So it's not an insignificant amount. So I don't really care whether it's 20% or 100. The point is that the Americans are giving us money for this. But broader than this was an interesting point I saw raised by someone who runs something to do with Desmond Tutu. Maybe they just used his name to make profit. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just surmising, but they were pointing out that actually the biggest people suffering as a result of this will be the hundreds of NGOs who rely on that funding, Kanthan. The hundreds of NGOs who rely on American aid funding.
You might... Can
I see a tear for them, please?
So I immediately took to social media and said, that... it's an absolute flippant disgrace that, 30 years later, we are relying on handouts.
Yeah. We rely on handouts, and we haven't established our own programs. You can kind of understand back in 2006, 7, 8, when we're taking money for ARVs, new program, new ideas, fighting against the government a little bit back then who didn't really want those drugs introduced. I get it. But 20 years later, what's your excuse for still needing funding on drugs that have become far less complex, far cheaper? What's the excuse? What's the excuse that you need American funding for that? Secondly, why are there hundreds of NGOs reliant on American funding for our system to operate?
Because they are there to influence the public at a range of levels. You know this well.
I know this well. And I also know that all those people who voted for Rise Mzansi probably work for these types of organizations.
Very much so.
Earn a lot of money as a result of it. That money off the back of American taxpayers in many instances. And sorry, folks, the party's over. Party's over. Under at least the Trump administration, you're done. Maybe you'll be back in the future. But for now, I reckon you're done. And time for us to stop paying our own way.
Or more crucially in this case, realizing that the money that is in fact coming in is not money that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And also questioning, I mean, I wonder, we ranked as a middle income country. So when you go overseas for conferences, or if you apply for a research grant or any of these types of things, and you want any kind of funding, then they'll often say, even sometimes they'll rank the attendance. I went to a conference last year, and they ranked the attendance fees based on what country you came from. So if you come from a high-income country, which would be like the United States, Britain, then, it's $1,000 for a ticket to attend the conference. If you come from a low-income country, Somalia, Sudan, then, you've only got to pay $100. But if you come from a middle-income country, it's like $700. It's kind of somewhere near the middle. And we're a middle-income country. I would question what we need any foreign aid for. We're not at war. We have a stable government. You might not like them, but
we've certainly got enough money to implement an NHI. Why can we not afford drugs?
It's a good question, Kanthan. It's a good question. We want an NHI. We want all kinds of fancy things, but we're getting aid from other countries. Doesn't seem to make any sense to me. And if I break it down into the most basic concept, it's rent seeking.
Yes.
That's what it is. It's rent seeking. The Americans originally, through some sort of altruistic generosity and some spycraft. It's true.
Remember that PEPFAR was a program that was started under George W. Bush.
Mm-hmm.
And, certainly it was a very good way of getting a foothold into a significant chunk of the bureaucratic systems of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. So if you consider it, whether you think it's completely altruistic or motivated, it's really irrelevant. What then happens is money comes in. They've obviously got to find ways to distribute the aid. So you've got to have officers for that. You need a CEO, Kanthan. You need a marketing officer and a human resources officer. Hell, you need a secretary. You need a driver, Kanthan. You need vehicles. Sure, you might even need some uniforms and some fancy shirts. Who knows what else you might need, Kanthan? And this is all of the rent seeking that goes on, and these people who've been rent seeking for years. And my big problem with charity organizations, which is most charity organizations spend more than 50% of what they get donated to them to pay off their administrative costs, which is the costs of people like the CEO, the management, etc. And that's not how charity should work.
Well, it's like, years ago I used to give money to the SPCA, and I stopped because, 80% of it goes to salaries rather than looking after the animals.
Exactly the point.
I used to donate money to Ushaka Marine World in Durban because, it was a world-class
rehabilitation center.
Yes. Yeah. And now, again, most of the money that they raise goes through to fund the people who work for the center who, they're not caring for the animals. These are the executives.
To be clear, those aren't the people looking after the animals. Those are people doing other jobs.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's my point on the aid, and I'm not in support of anyone who's unfortunately going to be directly damaged, individuals who won't be able to get an ARV, but I think it's very important, or any other healthcare that they otherwise would have gotten. But I think it's very important that who I blame for that is not the US government or Donald Trump. Who I blame for that is directly our own government, and our own government over decades.
Yes.
Who have saw fit to not provide the services as required by the population. Simple as that.
I mean, you consider just the simple thing of, Joburg General Hospital burns down, and we're not in a position to actually have it back to 100%.
Still hasn't been rebuilt.
Yeah.
Yeah. The fire-affected sections, although apparently there has been some work done, but it has not been rebuilt to its previous status.
Yes.
All right. Anything else?
No, I think, a lot of the stuff that we're going to touch on next week is probably going to be more of the global fallout that's going to come from the U.S. actually pulling the plug on a number of these programs.
Mm-hmm.
It's also very possible that within the next 2 weeks that the the war in Ukraine might suddenly reach a point of no return, because what's happened is that the Trump administration has effectively been backing off from the issue and just being silent. But what has been happening in the meanwhile is that the Russians have been advancing at a dizzy rate. And one of the last focal points of Ukrainian logistics fell yesterday. It's a town whose name I'm not going to dare try to pronounce, because these Russian/Ukrainian names are they're tongue twisters. But you're now at the stage where the Ukrainians are out of soldiers, they're out of weaponry, and it's always been a war of attrition. But the Russians are now establishing these strongholds, and once they have complete control of the banks of the Dnieper River, that's game over.
So just quickly on that, when you say game over to lead to some sort of negotiated truce, or game over to the point that Russia might say declare victory, and just take that territory and go home, or what? What do you envision takes place?
Essentially, at that point, Ukraine has got nowhere to fight, because remember that Russia's objectives were to take control of these territories. Mm-hmm. So it was the Donbas to start off with, which was Donetsk and Lugansk, and they subsequently extended that to Kherson and Zaporizhia. And so those are all of the territories that are on the east bank of the Dnieper River, which so the Dnieper effectively stretches all the way down to the Black Sea. So its mouth is in the Black Sea. But you follow the Dnieper all the way back up again, and it becomes the northern border of Ukraine, between Ukraine and Belarus. And so you're almost at the point where all of the territory of the Dnieper to
the Russian border.
To the Belarus border.
Yeah. Okay, but I mean, and then going east, obviously.
Yeah, well, going east, if you go east from there, you end up in Crimea. I'm pretty clear that if the Ukrainians don't surrender, and when I'm talking about game over, the Ukrainians basically have a choice of digging in their heels or surrendering. If they dig in their heels, I think the Russians are very likely to go after Odessa.
What do you don't think Trump is going to step in at that point?
No, because Trump doesn't have the option of actually stepping in at this point. Because remember that the things that the Russians are very insistent upon are not things that Trump can actually assent to at this point. So the best thing that Trump can do right now is to say, I'm putting this on the back burner for the next 100 days. I am focusing on what's happening in the Middle East, and then I'll pay attention to Ukraine later, because Ukraine is kind of low in my pecking order. And he's been very visible in terms of the stuff that he's doing in the Middle East. So you might have seen that he's authorized the shipment of a massive number of bombs.
I found it funny. They asked him why. Did you see that?
I didn't. Tell me what his response was.
It was either him or Pete Hegseth. I'm not sure, but I think it was him. They said, why are you doing that? And he said, because they paid for them. I thought that was brilliant. What a great response.
Yeah, that's a quick.
They bought the bombs from us. They paid for it.
Yeah,
and Biden then said, we're not sending them to you because politics. And,
yes.
And I'm sending them to them because they paid for them.
But look, at the same time that he sent these bombs across to Israel, he's already got a $600 billion commitment from MBS in Saudi Arabia to investment in the United States. So he's actually got enough to be able to make a plausible case for why he's not paying attention to the Russians. And frankly, if the Russians then end up completely overrunning Ukraine. Trump doesn't need to do anything. He can just keep sanctions in place against Russia. The Russians don't really care about the sanctions because they've already developed levels of self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I think we disagree here, but yeah.
Yeah, Trump will at some point, potentially have the ability to tell the Russians, look, in exchange for your freezing the conflict and agreeing to a particular bunch of stuff, we'll potentially let you back into the global financial system.
Yeah, I do think that's the big trading coin on both sides.
Yeah.
There are some cracks in the Russian economy, which even Vladimir Putin, he did a sit down in December, early January, I can't remember, it was somewhere around the New Year phase. And he admitted himself. He was asked a question by a reporter. Obviously, a lot of that stuff's planted. So, he says what he wants to say. Mm-hmm. But he admitted that there were some issues with the Russian economy. There's certainly a slowdown. I don't know enough about the Russian economy to say, but if he himself is saying that,
I think we should separate those two issues. Okay, and I think the fundamental thing that we must agree on is that even if the Russians right now, let's say their growth rate tanks spectacularly, and remember that by the IMF's own rankings, Russia's growth rate is outpacing that of most of Europe. So, that's not up for debate. But let's say even if those growth rates end up dropping, Russia is still producing more shells on an annual basis than the entire Western world put together. So they have the ability to sustain the war. Russia has mobilized over the past period of the war hundreds of thousands of people that they have not deployed yet. And they've been going through very intense training. They're fresh. And in other words, in terms of the conflict within Ukraine itself, if it simply means that there's no intervention on the part of the West at a military level, that Russia ends up winning it.
Okay, so let me just say that my opinion is that that's not going to happen. I think, I take your point on the...
So let me ask you, what does Trump do?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, which is that I think Trump will see it as a failure if Ukraine loses anything major. So I take your point about the Dnieper. I don't think he would consider that to be major, but Odessa would be major. Okay, overrunning Ukraine would be major. And I think he would view that as a bridge too far for it to be said under Trump.
But I'll go back to, what does he do?
Okay, so I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be, and I don't think it's going to be, I think it will happen in his first 100 days. It might be, I think it already is, in fact, under the radar. But I think there will be negotiations at some point. I think those negotiations will first be silent and then they will be open. And what he's going to do is he's going to offer Putin a way back in to the world of the League of Nations, for want of a better word, back into the G whatever it happens to be, back into the banking systems, which he wants Russia included in. We know Trump's view on Russia is that Russia and America do not have to be enemies. They may have disagreements on things, but that they ultimately should work towards betterment for the world. That's roughly where he sits.
Well, that was his view in his first term. And remember that effectively the deep state tied his hands behind his back.
That's right. That's not going to happen now. He's got his own SecDef, who, by the way, removed everything related to Mark Milley within his first day in office. Yes. Mark Milley is the traitorous general, former head of the term will come to me just now, but basically
Joint Chiefs.
Mm-hmm. And he was the one who in Trump's first term told the Chinese directly, don't worry about Trump. I will warn you of any issues that you need to know about, any attacks, etc., well in advance. And basically he was cooperating with a foreign enemy.
Yes.
So that is de facto treason. And I personally think they should court-martial him. I don't know if they're going to do that, but they've certainly removed him completely. They removed his security clearance, etc. He's he's been removed from the entire system. He's got Pete Hegseth. He's got his guy at the CIA now. He's got his people.
No, you and I agree on all of these. But I want to get back to what can he do?
I think that's what he's going to offer Putin, and I think Putin's going to take it. And I don't know I don't know exactly the context of what that's going to look like. I also think he's going to bring Zelensky and say to Zelensky, you listen to me. Zelensky's been saying some interesting things lately, changed his tune completely. He's basically turned around and said, we should have been able to sign the Boris Johnson agreement, basically. We should never have, the one Boris Johnson went and dispelled on behalf of the Biden administration. We really should have stopped this sooner. He's making all the right sounds for, I want to stop this. And he hasn't really, in the past few weeks, in anything I've seen of him, been very big on territory. So I haven't heard him say, we will not stop the war unless we get all our land back, which he was saying before and he hasn't said recently.
And you think that's Trump's influence?
So I think something's going on in the background where someone has said to Zelensky, sorry, dude, you lost the war. It wasn't a cool war. It wasn't a fair war. You didn't start the war, but that's unfortunately all's fair in love and war. That's where that comes from. And so you're going to have to compromise on something. We want to help you. We're going to help you rebuild, et cetera, all those promises. That's what will be promised to Zelensky. Reinvestment, rebuilding, protection to some point of him directly, because I think he needs it. I think he's been incredibly corrupt. And I also think if he ran an election, which, by the way, he's suspended. He's not meant to still be in power, but he suspended elections. So Ukraine is currently not a democratic country. I think that will provide him protections and potentially some help with trying to keep him in power. Russia gets to join the League of Nations again, which gets a whole bunch of things back on the table. Bearing in mind in the background, the reason the Russian economy that you're talking about has grown more than Europe, one of those big reasons has been that they're still supplying shitloads of gas and oil to their European neighbors, who can't survive without that gas and oil because people like Angela Merkel shut down all the nuclear plants.
And look, Trump was actually calling that correctly because, he wants to drastically reduce the cost of energy because he says by doing that, we are reducing the amount of money that's flowing into Russia. So
Trump,
and he's 100% right on that.
Trump wants to ship tons and tons of liquid gas and oil to everywhere in the world. Yes. What you're going to see as a result of that generally is a drop in the oil price and a drop in fuel prices, and as a result, a drop in prices hopefully across the board as input costs come down. But what that means for Russia is it means that they potentially aren't benefiting as much.
Correct.
And so if Putin's smart, he takes Trump's deal.
I think all of us want lower energy costs across the world.
100%.
And that is the fundamental underpinning of Trump's entire economic policy. And I think everyone around the world should actually basically agree with that. Is he correct that a side effect of that is that it's going to be less money for the Russian economy? Yeah, absolutely, spot on. But do I think that that's going to be enough to actually make it not cost effective for Putin to continue with the war? No, I think that he's going to be able to do that going forward quite a while.
Okay, let's see who's right. I think into the Ukraine conflict probably within the next 6 months.
Yeah, 6 months, yeah. When I said 2 weeks, okay, basically when I was referring to 2 weeks, it's at the level of, significant military changes taking place.
Perfectly fine. All I'm saying is I think Trump will create influence there, and there will be a negotiated settlement, and that negotiated settlement I would estimate would probably be within the next 6 months.
Yeah.
And I think part of that negotiated settlement, as I've said, would be the terms for Zelensky and the terms for Putin, which puts them both in quite a pretty position. Putin still gets some of the regions. I think he gets Donetsk. I think he gets Luhansk. So he gets to have a victory for his people from his perspective. He also then gets they get SWIFT back and all the rest of that, which brings them back into the whole world. And so the Russians get to feel like they're part of everything again, which is also just a sentimental victory, but it works a lot for populations. And I that's how I think it will go. But maybe you'll be correct, and he will just continue the war, steamroll over Ukraine. Trump won't give a shit, and then we end up with just a place where Ukraine used to be, now in the state of Russia.
Yes,
it remains to be seen. Mm-hmm. Good. Let's call it for the day.
All right,
a good one.
I think so, and it should be an interesting next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to confirmation hearings for Tulsi Gabbard, for RFK Jr.
And I'm looking
forward for Cash Patel.
And I'm looking forward to the DA withdrawing from the Government of National
And
Unity.
you're looking forward to the DA withdrawing from the Government of National Unity. I don't think they have the balls for that. I agree with you, but I just don't think they have the balls to do anything of consequence anymore. Right. Thank you, as always, for listening. Just a reminder to subscribe if you haven't already. If you do like the show, please tell people about it. So we're at the point where YouTube and the streaming platforms no longer recommend the podcast specifically. There's like this, when you dip your toe in, they kind of highlight you to make you feel excited so that you get a lot of volume. We're still getting decent volume, but it could be better. So let's share it around, please. And as always, thank you for listening or watching. We'll catch you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.